All right, so now we're going to continue talking about some of the key issues for Chapter 5 in Plakia's textbook. So Plakius begins with introducing some of the raw data, some of the figures that help us sort of put the issues into perspective. Right, so she points out that agriculture is a leading driver of climate change, especially as it relates to water use and pollution and biodiversity loss. So, in other words, we're thinking about things in terms of what and how we eat shapes or actually reshapes entire ecosystems, right? So, think about it in terms of climate change, for instance. When we're thinking about climate change, agriculture is really significant in this regard because it contributes a significant share of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Things like methane production by livestock or nitrous oxides from fertilizers, CO2 from deforestation, and so forth. It's also very problematic in terms of water use. Irrigation accounts for a large fraction of fresh water use worldwide. Indeed, overuse depletes aquifers and can cause rivers to run dry before it ever even reaches the sea. And as it relates to soil, keep in mind that intense farming practices deplete soil nutrients. And this leads to erosion. And well, this leads to erosion, which then leads to a kind of desertification. And this is all because heavy soil is itself a kind of a living ecosystem. And so when we degrade it, we are losing fertility and carbon storage capacity that exists within the soil itself. Now consider the pollution that occurs. Fertilizers wash into rivers and lakes, which then creates dead zones where oxygen levels are simply too low for fish to survive. Pesticides then are allowed to accumulate in these ecosystems, which harms all sorts of different species, specifically species like pollinators. And that then has a chain reaction all throughout many different ecosystems. And of course, that leads to biodiversity loss in so many different ways, especially as we're thinking about agriculture. Whenever we clear land for agriculture, this is actually one of the single biggest causes for species extinction that we're aware of. So Plakus is essentially pointing out that agriculture all over the world, but especially as we're thinking about it in the U.S., is a major contributor to these sorts of environmental disasters and contributors to climate change. Indeed, in the US, agriculture alone accounts for roughly 40% of land use. That's huge. That's almost half of the entire United States. And regarding fresh water use, it's about 80%. About 80% of fresh water use in the United States, it goes directly to agriculture. And of course, animal agriculture is particularly destructive. And it consumes far more energy than it actually produces. In fact, I have students that oftentimes try to argue that eating animals is necessary, either for health reasons or for the economy and so on and so forth. But it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Using animals for agriculture consumes way more energy than it actually produces. For instance, 7 pounds of grain are required to produce a single pound of beef. 4 pounds of grain is required for a single pound of pork, and 2 pounds of grain is required for 1 pound of chicken. Right, so you don't have any situation where you're producing more energy than you're actually using. It takes far more energy to raise these animals than it does that we get from eating them. So when we think about the waste that's involved, the greenhouse gases, the pollutants, the destruction to ecosystems, all of this leaves a massive ecological footprint that we should be aware of. And so this raises the first question that I want you to think about. Of these different impacts, climate change, water usage, the destruction of the ecosystems that exist within the soil, the pollutants that are contributing to all sorts of different ecosystem destruction, the biodiversity loss, of all these different impacts, which do you think is the most urgent? So which one do you see reflected most in your own community? Most of us, if not all of us, live here in Nebraska. So we probably do have some sort of opinion about these things. So I want you to think about that. Now I want to turn to two different important approaches. These are approaches that Placius introduces ways to sort of frame and think about environmental ethics in general. So I'm going to lay out these two different approaches now in this video, and then we'll dig into the details a bit more later on in another video. All right, so there's two main approaches that Placius introduces to help us kind of put a frame around how to understand this issue of environmental ethics. On the one hand, we have what's called anthropocentric, and on the other hand, we have ecocentric approaches. So essentially, we're thinking about why should we care about these impacts, right? All the different impacts that we were just discussing. And so Placius is going to go through these two broad approaches. First, as it relates to anthropocentric, which basically just means human-centered approaches, the basic idea here is that the environment can be used as a kind of instrumental good. The environment can be used in a way that allows us to produce things that we need. The environment is instrumentally valuable insofar as it helps us live a better life. It helps us live a healthy life. It helps us maybe with our economic system. Maybe in terms of capitalism, then we need the environment because we're using the environment as a kind of resource that we can exploit. Right, so the environment is valuable because of what it produces for humans. That's why it's human-centered. So it can help us produce food, it can help us produce clean air and water, economic resources, maybe even a stable climate. Right, so when we're thinking about soil erosion, the reason why that matters is because it undermines human agriculture. Or when we're thinking about policies that we're going to put into place, we can think about how these can help issues like sustainability that will allow the resources to remain available for future human generations, for future use by humans. Right? So those are the kinds of issues that we're concerned with as it relates to this approach that is human-centered, this anthropocentric approach to environmental ethics. Now, on the other hand, we have what's called ecocentric, and that's going to specifically deal with what's sometimes called the last person argument, right? So ecocentrism basically claims that ecosystems, species, natural systems have value in and of themselves. So this is a way of denying that ecosystems and the environment has only instrumental value. Rather, the environment and these ecosystems have value in and of themselves, independent of anything else. And now we'll look at the last person argument here in the next video, but essentially it's a thought experiment where we're asked to imagine that we're the very last human that's alive, and we're going to destroy a forest before we die. And if only human interests matter, then the destruction seems to be morally neutral, right? Shouldn't matter at all. Yet, at the same time, most of us think that that's, in many ways, deeply wrong. Even if there's no humans that are left that might ever be affected, still the intuition seems to suggest that ecosystems have some sort of intrinsic value independent of what they might produce or provide for us as a resource. Then we will move on to talk about ecocentrism as it relates to what's sometimes thought of as holistic ethics, where holistic ethics tries to evaluate actions in relation to wholes, specifically whole ecosystems, whole species, or whole biotic communities. There's this notion of a kind of deep ecology, which emphasizes radical respect for nature, seeing nature as importantly intertwined with human beings, where human beings aren't standing alone, but human beings, you and I, are part of this structure or this web of life. Then finally, that's going to introduce what's sometimes called the land ethic. And this land ethic is oftentimes associated with Aldo Leopold, where basically we're trying to understand things in terms of right actions are those that preserve the integrity and stability and the beauty of the biotic community in general, right? So Leopold asks us to imagine ourselves members of an ecological community in the very same way that we are members of a family or of a nation or of cultures. So those are some of the issues that we're going to dig into. That's a very general kind of overview of what we're about to deal with. So stay tuned, and we'll talk about these issues in more detail.